Sometimes the cruelest punishment becomes life's greatest blessing. Clara Hastings never imagined that being cast out by her own community would lead her to discover who she truly was. In 1800s frontier Colorado, the young widow was sent as a mail-order bride to mountain man Silas McGraw, not as a gift, but as punishment for her supposed inability to bear children. The townspeople expected her to suffer in isolation with the reclusive Grizzly McGraw. They were wrong about everything. Silas had his own plans, treating Clara with unexpected kindness and respect. He taught her to survive in the wilderness, to find strength in herself, and to build something meaningful together. As they worked side by side on their mountain homestead, Clara discovered abilities she never knew existed, while Silas revealed a gentle heart that surprised everyone who knew his fearsome reputation. Together, they created a partnership that defied every cruel expectation, proving that love and family aren't defined by society's narrow rules. But what happens when the town discovers the shocking truth about Clara? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wagon wheels creaked a mournful song as they climbed the narrow mountain trail, each turn taking Clara Hastings farther from the life she had known and deeper into an uncertain future. October frost painted the aspen leaves gold against the granite peaks of the Colorado Territory, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of pine and approaching winter. She clutched her worn leather satchel, everything she owned now fit, inside that single bag, and tried not to think about the comfortable home she'd left behind or the cruel laughter that had followed her from the town square. "Almost there now, ma'am," called Jake Morrison, the weathered driver who'd been paid handsomely to deliver her to her fate. His voice held a note of pity that made Clara's cheeks burn with shame. Everyone knew why she was being sent away. The whole town had heard Judge Patterson's pronouncement: "A woman who cannot fulfill her primary duty has no place among decent folk. Perhaps the mountain air will teach you humility." The truth was more complex and more painful. Clara had been married to Thomas Hastings for 3 years before consumption took him last spring. 3 years of hoping, praying, and enduring the monthly disappointment that came with her continued barrenness. Thomas had been kind about it, at least publicly, but she'd seen the doubt in his mother's eyes, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. When the town doctor confirmed what everyone suspected, that Clara was incapable of bearing children, her fate was sealed. "There it is," Jake said, pointing through the pine trees to a clearing ahead. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a crude shack, perhaps a tumble-down cabin that matched the stories she'd heard about Grizzly McGraw. Instead, she saw a solid log home with a stone chimney, sending up a curl of welcoming smoke. The cabin sat in a natural meadow, surrounded by towering pines, with a clear creek running nearby. Outbuildings included a well-built barn, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be a workshop. Split-rail fences marked boundaries, and she could see a vegetable garden, carefully tended despite the late season. "This is it?" Clara asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Aye, ma'am. Silas McGraw's place. Been here nigh on 15 years, he say. Built it all with his own 2 hands after he came back from the war." The cabin door opened, and a man stepped onto the covered porch. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she got her first look at her intended husband. The stories had painted him as a wild man, barely civilized, with matted hair and clothes that hadn't seen soap in months. The reality couldn't have been more different. Silas McGraw stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical work. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, though it touched his collar, and his beard was clean and well-groomed. He wore simple clothes, wool pants, a flannel shirt, and leather boots, but everything was clean and well-maintained. Most surprising were his eyes, intelligent, gentle, and tinged with something that looked like understanding, rather than the cruel indifference she had expected. "Mrs. Hastings," he said as Jake helped her down from the wagon. His voice was deep and measured, with none of the roughness she'd anticipated. "Welcome to Pine Meadow." Clara found herself momentarily speechless. This was the fearsome mountain man she'd been sent to as punishment. The man who was supposed to make her life miserable in payment for her failings as a woman. "Mr. McGraw," she managed, dropping a small curtsy out of habit. "I thank you for taking me in." Something flickered in his eyes. Was it amusement? "Jake, thank you for bringing Mrs. Hastings safely up the mountain. Would you stay for supper? It's a long ride back to town." The driver glanced between them nervously. "That's kind of you, Silas, but I'd best be getting back before dark. Got the wife expecting me." He set Clara's trunk and satchel on the porch, steps, tipped his hat, and climbed back onto the wagon seat with obvious relief. As the wagon disappeared down the trail, Clara found herself alone with her new husband. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. She waited for him to speak first, to lay out the terms of their arrangement, to make clear what would be expected of her. Instead, Silas picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and gestured toward the cabin. "You must be tired from the journey. Would you like to see your room? I thought you might want to rest before we talk." Her room? Clara followed him onto the porch, noting the hand-carved rocking chair beside the door and the neat stack of split firewood. The interior of the cabin was even more surprising than the exterior. The main room featured a stone fireplace with a comfortable-looking settee and 2 chairs arranged before it. Bookshelves lined one wall, actual books, more than she'd ever seen in one place, except for the church. A dining table and chairs occupied the space near the kitchen area, which boasted a modern cast-iron stove and well-organized shelves of dishes and provisions. "The cabin has 2 bedrooms, Silas explained, carrying her things toward a door on the far side of the main room. "I thought you'd prefer the eastern one. It gets the morning sun, and there's a nice view of the creek." Clara's confusion deepened. Most frontier cabins were single rooms, with families sleeping together out of necessity. The idea of having her own bedroom seemed almost too good to believe. The room he showed her was small, but comfortable, with a real bed covered in a handmade quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and a window that indeed offered a lovely view of the creek and the mountains beyond. Someone, Silas, she realized, had placed a basin and pitcher on the dresser, along with clean towels and a bar of lavender soap. "I'll let you settle in," he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "There's fresh water in the pitcher, and if you need anything else, just call out. I'll be in the kitchen starting supper." He turned to go, then paused at the doorway. "Mrs. Hastings, Clara, if I may, I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever brought you to this arrangement, whatever you've been told about me, or what's expected, you have my word that you'll be treated with respect. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be." With that, he left her alone, closing the door quietly behind him. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind reeling. This gentle, thoughtful man was the savage mountain hermit she'd been sent to as punishment. The man who was supposed to work her like a mule and treat her with the contempt she supposedly deserved. She moved to the window and looked out at the peaceful scene beyond. The creek sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight, and she could see deer grazing at the edge of the meadow. Pine Meadow, he'd called it. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. For the first time in months, she felt something other than shame and resignation. She felt hope. The sound of activity from the kitchen drew her from her contemplation. The aroma of cooking food reminded her that she hadn't eaten since dawn, too nervous to accept Jake's offer of jerky and hardtack. She unpacked her few belongings, 3 dresses, undergarments, a few personal items, and the Bible that had belonged to her mother, and changed into her better dress, a simple blue wool that brought out her eyes. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Silas setting the table for 2. He'd changed into a clean white shirt, and his hair was damp as if he'd taken time to wash. The consideration touched her more than she could say. "I hope you like venison stew," he said, ladling food into bowls. I made biscuits this morning and there's honey from my own hives. Clara took her seat, still trying to reconcile this reality with everything she'd been told. You keep bees? Among other things. I've found that mountain life requires a man to learn many skills. I keep chickens for eggs, grow what vegetables I can, hunt and fish for meat, and trade with my neighbors for what I can't produce myself. It's a good life, if a quiet one. The stew was delicious, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that tasted of the mountains themselves. The biscuits were light and flaky, better than any she'd made herself. As they ate, Silas talked easily about the land, the wildlife, the neighbors who lived scattered throughout the high valleys. His voice was educated, she realized. He spoke like a man who'd had schooling, who'd read books and seen something of the world beyond these mountains. You have many books, she observed, glancing at the shelves. Reading helps pass the long winter evenings. Do you read, Clara? Oh yes, I love to read. My father believed in education, even for daughters. She paused, remembering the disapproval that belief had earned from some quarters. I suppose that was another failing on my part. Silas set down his spoon and looked at her directly. Intelligence is never a failing. Neither is education. Any man who thinks otherwise is a fool. The certainty in his voice, the lack of judgment, made Clara's eyes prick with unexpected tears. When was the last time anyone had spoken of her intelligence as a virtue rather than an unseemly peculiarity? After supper, Silas showed her around the property as the sun set behind the western peaks. The barn housed 2 horses, a milk cow, and a handful of chickens, who regarded Clara with bright, curious eyes. The workshop contained tools she recognized and others she didn't, along with projects in various stages of completion. Furniture, it looked like, crafted with obvious skill and care. You made the furniture in the cabin? She asked. Most of it. I find working with wood peaceful. There's something satisfying about taking a rough piece of timber and turning it into something useful and beautiful, like taking a discarded woman. And treating her with dignity, Clara thought, but she kept the observation to herself. As they walked back to the cabin under a sky brilliant with stars, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had been troubling her all evening. Mr. McGraw, Silas, I need to ask you something directly. Of course. Why did you agree to this arrangement? You seem to be a man who could have his choice of wives, yet you accepted a woman who was sent to you as punishment. A woman who can't give you children. The last words came out in a whisper, but he heard them clearly. Silas stopped walking and turned to face her. In the moonlight, his expression was serious, but not unkind. Can I ask you something first? Do you want children, Clara? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she wanted. Yes, more than anything. I've always dreamed of being a mother. Then we have that in common. I wanted children too once upon a time. But life doesn't always give us what we want, does it? Sometimes it gives us what we need instead. They reached the porch, and Silas paused with his hand on the door latch. As for why I accepted this arrangement, I'll be honest with you, I was lonely. I've lived alone on this mountain for 15 years, and I'd grown weary of my own company. When Judge Patterson wrote to ask if I'd take a wife, I said yes. Not because I needed someone to cook and clean, I manage well enough on my own, but because I hoped to find a companion, someone to share the beauty of this place with, someone to talk to besides the horses and chickens. He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. I think perhaps we both need the same thing, Clara. We need someone who won't judge us for what we lack, but will appreciate us for what we have to offer. What do you think? Standing there in the mountain moonlight, listening to this unexpected man speak of companionship and acceptance, Clara felt the tight knot of shame that had lived in her chest for months finally begin to loosen. Maybe, just maybe, her exile to the mountains wouldn't be a punishment after all. I think, she said softly, that sounds like exactly what I need. Clara's first week at Pine Meadow passed in a strange, peaceful routine that felt almost too good to be real. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Silas splitting wood or tending to the animals, and she would dress quickly to help with breakfast. He never expected it. Indeed, he seemed surprised by her eagerness to contribute, but Clara found comfort in having useful work to do. On this particular morning, as frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, Silas knocked gently on her bedroom door. "Clara, I'm sorry to wake you, but there's been an accident down at the Harper place. Young Billy took a bad fall from their barn roof. His mother sent word asking if I could come help." Clara opened the door, instantly alert. She'd heard Silas mention the Harper family, homesteaders with 3 children who lived about 2 miles down the valley. "Of course you must go. Is there anything I can do?" Silas was already reaching for his coat and a leather satchel she hadn't noticed before. "Actually, yes. Could you gather some clean cloths and boil water? I may need to bring the boy back here, if his injuries are severe." As he hurried toward the door, Clara caught sight of the contents of his satchel: surgical instruments, bottles of medicine, rolled bandages. Her heart began to race with recognition. "Silas, wait! You're a doctor!" He paused, his hand on the door latch. "I was, a long time ago, during the war and for a few years after. But that's a conversation for another time. Right now, Billy. Harper needs help." After he left, Clara stood in the quiet cabin, her mind spinning. A doctor, that explained so much. The education, the books, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. But it also raised new questions. What had driven a trained physician to abandon his practice for life as a mountain hermit? She busied herself following his instructions, boiling water and gathering clean linens. As she worked, she found herself drawn to his bookshelves, which she now examined with new understanding. Medical texts sat alongside philosophy, literature, and natural history. One shelf held journals filled with detailed drawings of plants, their properties carefully noted in Silas's precise handwriting. Her pulse quickened as she recognized many of the plants he'd catalogued. White willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, digitalis for heart conditions. This was far more than amateur herb gathering. This was the work of someone with extensive medical knowledge. A leather-bound book caught her attention, and she pulled it from the shelf with trembling fingers. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and when she opened it, pressed flowers and leaves fell out. Each specimen was carefully mounted and labeled, with notes about harvesting times, preparation methods, and medicinal uses. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew this book intimately, though she'd never seen this particular copy. It was a medical herbal, the same type that had belonged to her mentor, old Doc Whitman, back in her hometown. The same type she'd studied in secret for years, learning everything she could about healing and midwifery, despite the disapproval it earned her. "You know about medicines." Clara spun around to find Silas standing in the doorway, his satchel in one hand and a young boy cradled in his arms. Billy Harper was perhaps 8 years old, his face pale with shock and his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Yes, Clara stammered, setting the book aside. "I studied with Dr. Whitman before he died. Is Billy—" "Broken arm and a concussion. I've set the bone, but he needs to be watched carefully for the next day or 2. His parents are dealing with a sick infant at home, so I told them I'd keep him here." Silas carried the boy to the settee near the fire. "Clara, I need your help. Can you prepare a willow bark tea for the pain while I get him settled?" Without hesitation, Clara moved to the kitchen. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, measuring the bark, steeping it at the proper temperature. As she worked, she felt a familiar sense of purpose. A rightness that she hadn't experienced since Doc Whitman's death had ended her informal apprenticeship. "How much laudanum did you give him?" she asked, bringing the tea to where Silas was examining the boy's pupils with a small lamp. "A quarter grain. He's small for his age." Silas looked up at her with surprise. "You know laudanum dosages." "I assisted Dr. Whitman with difficult cases, childbirth mostly, but also injuries and illnesses." Clara knelt beside the settee, her fingers automatically finding Billy's pulse point. His heart rate is elevated but steady, no signs of shock. For the next several hours, they worked together, caring for Billy. Clara found herself falling back into old patterns, anticipating Silas's needs, monitoring the boy's condition, adjusting his position to keep him comfortable. It felt like coming home to herself. When Billy finally woke, groggy but alert, Clara was the one who coaxed him to drink broth and take his medicine. She told him stories to distract him from the pain, and when he cried for his mother, she held him with gentle firmness until he fell asleep again. "You have a gift with children," Silas observed, as they sat by the fire that evening, Billy sleeping peacefully on the settee between them. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I always wanted to work with children and women, helping with births, caring for new mothers, but it wasn't considered proper for a woman to practice medicine, even unofficially. Not proper for a woman to use her God-given talents to help others." Silas shook his head. "What kind of society discourages healing?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Clara wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she focused on the immediate concern. "Silas, why did you stop practicing medicine? You're clearly skilled, and people need doctors out here." Silas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "During the war, I was a battlefield surgeon. I saved who I could, but I lost so many. After the war, I tried to return to normal practice, but I found I couldn't bear it anymore. Every patient reminded me of the ones I'd failed to save. So I came here, thinking I could leave medicine behind. But you couldn't," Clara said softly. "You still help people, only in emergencies, only when there's no other choice." He looked at her across the flickering firelight. "But today, working with you, I remembered what it felt like to heal rather than just fight death. You made me remember why I became a doctor in the first place." Clara felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding taking root. "And you made me remember who I used to be, before the town decided I was useless because I couldn't bear children." Silas leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight. "Clara, can I ask you something personal? About your marriage? About the accusations of infertility?" Her throat tightened. "What do you want to know? Were you ever properly examined by a physician? Did anyone actually determine that you were the cause of your childlessness?" The question struck her like a physical blow. In 3 years of marriage, no doctor had ever examined her. The assumption had been automatic. When a wife didn't conceive, it was always the wife's fault. Thomas had been from a prominent family, healthy and virile. The failure had to be hers. "No," she whispered. "Dr. Morrison just said that since Thomas was obviously capable, the problem must be with me." "It's always the woman's fault, isn't it?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Not always. In fact, not even usually. But it's easier for society to blame the woman than to question the man's capacity." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Clara, would you be willing to let me examine you? As a doctor, I mean. It might put some questions to rest." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of such an intimate examination, even by a physician, filled her with shame and fear. But looking at Silas's gentle, professional demeanor, she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "You really think, could it be possible that I'm not barren?" "I think," Silas said carefully, "that you deserve to know the truth about your own body. Whatever that truth might be." That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. What if she wasn't broken? What if the shame she'd carried wasn't justified? What if there was still hope for the family she'd always dreamed of? Outside her window, an owl called from the pines, and Clara felt as if she stood on the edge of a precipice. Tomorrow, she might learn something that would change everything she believed about herself. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. In equal measure, Billy stirred on the settee in the main room, and Clara heard Silas's quiet footsteps as he went to check on the boy. The sound of his gentle voice, murmuring comfort to the injured child, made her chest tight with emotion. Here was a man who could have been a father, who would have been wonderful with children of his own. Instead, he spent his days alone on a mountain, carrying his own burdens of loss and regret. Maybe, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, they could heal each other's wounds, as well as they'd healed Billy Harper's broken arm. Maybe their exile from the world below wasn't punishment at all, but providence. 2 days later, after Billy Harper had been safely returned to his grateful parents, Clara found herself standing in Silas's workshop, watching him plane a piece of pine into perfect smoothness. The rhythmic scraping sound was soothing, and she discovered that she enjoyed these quiet moments when they worked side by side, each focused on their own tasks. She was mending a tear in one of his shirts, a skill that had earned her approval. In town, but seemed to genuinely please him here, when she noticed something glinting from beneath a stack of papers on his workbench. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the metallic gleam. Silas followed her gaze and stiffened slightly. After a moment's hesitation, he set down his plane and moved the papers aside, revealing a tarnished military medal. Clara could make out an eagle and the words, "For gallantry in action," before he quickly covered it again. "Just old memories," he said quietly, but Clara had seen the way his jaw tightened, the shadow that passed over his face. She set down her mending and moved closer. "You were decorated in the war." "It wasn't a question." Silas sighed and picked up the medal, turning it over in his calloused hands. 32nd Illinois Infantry, later transferred to the Medical Corps. This was from Antietam. I spent 3 days on the battlefield operating under fire, trying to save boys who were barely old enough to shave. Clara had heard stories about Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, they said. She tried to imagine Silas as a young man, working frantically to save lives while bullets flew around him. "Is that why you became a hermit? Because of what you saw in the war?" "Partly." Silas set the medal down and picked up his plane again. "But he didn't resume working. After the war, I tried to go back to civilian practice. I even got married. A sweet girl named Elizabeth who thought she could heal my nightmares with patience and love." Clara felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy. What happened to her? "She died in childbirth. The baby too. A son we'd planned to name Matthew." His voice was steady, but Clara could hear the old pain beneath the control. "I was the doctor attending the birth. I couldn't save either of them." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared grief. Clara understood now why he'd retreated to this mountain sanctuary, why he'd given up medicine, why he lived alone with his books and his woodworking and his carefully tended garden. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been unbearable. I thought it was God's punishment for all the men I couldn't save during the war. Elizabeth paid the price for my failures." He finally resumed planning, the motion more aggressive now. "That's when I came here. I swore I'd never practice medicine. Again, never risk another life on my imperfect skills." Clara watched him work, understanding dawning slowly. "But you still help people. Billy Harper, others who come to you in emergencies. You haven't really given up medicine at all." "I help when I have no choice, when there's no one else." Silas looked up at her. "But I don't seek it out anymore. I don't advertise my skills or encourage people to depend on me. Yet here you are, teaching me about mountain survival, showing me which plants are edible, which ones have healing properties. You're still a healer, Silas. You just heal differently now." Over the following days, Silas did indeed teach her about mountain life with the same patience he'd shown with Billy Harper. He showed her how to read weather patterns in the shape of clouds, how to preserve meat for the long winter, how to bank fires so they'd burn all night without risk. Clara found herself absorbing it all eagerly, her mind hungry for practical knowledge after years of being told that learning was unseemly in a woman. "You're a natural student," Silas observed one afternoon, as Clara successfully identified a stand of wild ginger. Most people struggle to remember the difference between similar plants. I had a good teacher. Clara carefully harvested some of the root, following the method Silas had shown her. Dr. Whitman used to say, I had the best memory for botanical medicine he'd ever encountered. Why didn't you pursue formal training? There are medical colleges for women now in the East. Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. A woman from a small frontier town seeking medical training? My father might have supported the idea, but he died when I was 16. After that, I was expected to marry well and produce children. Education beyond the basics was seen as a waste of time and resources. They walked back toward the cabin in comfortable silence, their gathering baskets full of roots, berries, and medicinal herbs. Clara found herself studying Silas's profile, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, the gentle strength in his hands as he held back branches for her to pass. Silas, she said as they reached the porch. The examination you mentioned, I've been thinking about it. He stopped, his expression carefully neutral. And I'd like to know the truth, whatever it might be. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she set down her basket. I've lived with shame and uncertainty for so long. If there's a chance that I'm not, that I could still... She couldn't finish the sentence, the hope too fragile to voice fully. Silas nodded gravely. We'll do it properly, with dignity and respect. Tomorrow morning, if you're ready. That evening they sat by the fire reading, Silas with a volume of Shakespeare, Clara with a book of poetry she'd found on his shelves. The domesticity of the scene struck her as almost surreal. A month ago, she'd been the town pariah, shipped off to suffer with a savage mountain man. Now she sat in comfortable silence with a learned, gentle physician who treated her as an equal. Silas, she said suddenly, why didn't you ever remarry? After Elizabeth, I mean. You're not that old and you could have found companionship. He looked up from his book, considering the question. I suppose I convinced myself I was better off alone, safer for everyone if I didn't risk caring about someone again. He paused. What about you? You're still young, still beautiful. You could have remarried instead of accepting this arrangement. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at his casual mention of her beauty. No one wanted a barren wife. The few men who expressed interest made it clear they saw me as a housekeeper and cook, nothing more. At least here, you treat me as a person with thoughts and opinions worth hearing, because you are a person worth hearing. Any man who couldn't see that was a fool. The sincerity in his voice made Clara's chest tighten with emotion. When was the last time anyone had valued her thoughts, her intelligence, her company? She couldn't remember. As they prepared for bed, Clara felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation about the morning ahead. Whatever Silas's examination revealed, it would change something fundamental about how she saw herself. She could only hope that change would be for the better. That night, she dreamed of children, not the bitter dreams that had plagued her for years, but gentle visions of little ones with dark hair and intelligent eyes, learning to identify plants and helping with the animals. In her dream, Silas was there too, patient and kind, teaching small hands to whittle wood and showing bright minds the wonder of the natural world. She woke with tears on her cheeks and hope blooming in her heart like mountain wildflowers after a long, hard winter. The morning of the examination dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and painting everything with warm light. Clara had awakened before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and found Silas already in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. "Good morning," he said gently, not commenting on her obvious anxiety. "I thought we might want something light before we address your questions." Clara managed a smile and accepted the cup of coffee he offered. "I appreciate your discretion. I know this is unusual. Medical examinations between unmarried people often are, but you have every right to understand. Your own body, Clara. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." After breakfast, Silas prepared the bedroom with the same professional care Clara had observed when he treated Billy Harper. Clean sheets, proper lighting, his medical instruments laid out with precision. He'd even found a sheet to drape over. Her for modesty. "I'll be as quick and gentle as possible," he assured her. "If you need me to stop at any point, just say so." The examination was thorough but respectful, conducted with the impersonal efficiency of a trained physician. Silas explained everything as he went, his voice calm and clinical. When it was over, Clara dressed behind a privacy screen while he made notes in a medical journal. "Well?" she asked when she emerged, trying to read his expression. Silas looked up from his notes, and Clara's heart stopped at what she saw in his face. Not the gentle pity she'd expected if her fears were confirmed, but something that looked almost like anger. "Clara," he said carefully, "there is absolutely nothing wrong with your reproductive system. Nothing at all. In fact, you appear to be exceptionally healthy and perfectly capable of conceiving and carrying children." Clara sank into the chair beside his desk, her knees suddenly too weak to support her. "But that's impossible. Dr. Morrison said, Thomas and I tried for 3 years. Dr. Morrison is either incompetent or deliberately dishonest," Silas said bluntly. "Any physician worth his credentials could have determined your health with a basic examination. The fact that no one ever bothered to examine you properly tells me everything I need to know about the medical care in your town." Clara's mind reeled. "But if there's nothing wrong with me, then why didn't I conceive? Thomas was healthy, virile. Everyone said so." Silas hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Clara, male infertility is far more common than most people realize. It's simply not discussed in polite society because it challenges certain assumptions about masculinity. Without examining your late husband, I can't say for certain, but the fact that you never conceived, despite being perfectly healthy, suggests the issue may have been with him." The room seemed to spin around Clara as the implications hit her. 3 years of shame, of believing herself broken and worthless, the cruel exile from her community, the whispered comments about her failure as a woman, all based on a lie. Or at best, a willful ignorance that had destroyed her life. "All this time," she whispered, "I thought I was cursed. I thought God was punishing me for some sin I didn't even know I'd committed." Silas moved to kneel beside her chair, his hands gently covering hers. "You are not cursed, Clara. You are not broken. You are a healthy, intelligent, capable woman who was failed by the very people who should have protected and supported you." Clara began to cry then, not the bitter tears of grief she'd shed so many times, but the overwhelming relief of a burden she'd carried for years finally being lifted from her shoulders. Silas let her cry, offering silent comfort with his presence and the warm strength of his hands. When her tears finally subsided, Clara found herself studying his face with new eyes. This man had given her back herself, had restored her hope and her dignity with his honesty and expertise. How could she ever repay such a gift? "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't have words for what you've given me today." "You don't need words. Just promise me you'll never again let anyone convince you that you're less than the remarkable woman you are." That afternoon, they took a long walk through the pine forest, Clara's steps lighter than they'd been in years. Every breath of mountain air seemed to fill her with new life, new possibilities. As they climbed toward a rocky outcropping that Silas said offered spectacular views, Clara found herself really looking at the man beside her for the first time. When had his presence become so comforting? When had his gentle voice become the sound she most looked forward to hearing each morning? When had the idea of leaving this mountain sanctuary become unthinkable? "There," Silas said as they reached the top of the outcrop. "This is why I love this place." The view was breathtaking. The entire valley spread below them, a tapestry of gold and green forest broken by the silver thread of the creek. Snow-capped peaks rose in every direction, and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at directly. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed. "I can see why you never want to leave." They sat on a fallen log to rest, and Clara noticed Silas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" I was just thinking how different you look now than when you first arrived. There's color in your cheeks, light in your eyes. You look," he paused, seeming to search for the right word. "You look like yourself." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I feel like myself. For the first time in years, I feel like the person I was meant to be." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching an eagle soar between the peaks, Clara realized that something had shifted between them over the past weeks. The polite distance of strangers had given way to genuine friendship, and friendship was blossoming into something deeper and more complex. When Silas's hand brushed hers as he pointed out a deer picking its way through the trees below, Clara didn't pull away. When he looked at her with eyes that held more than just kindness, she didn't lower her gaze. The attraction that had been building between them was no longer something either could ignore. "Clara," Silas said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "When I agreed to this arrangement, I thought I was rescuing a woman who needed help. I never expected—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I never expected to feel this way about someone again." Clara's heart began to race. "What way?" Instead of answering with words, Silas cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her. It was soft and tentative at first, asking permission rather than demanding. Clara's response was instinctive. She leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. Clara looked into Silas's eyes and saw her own wonder reflected there. "I've been falling in love with you," he admitted quietly. "I tried to fight it, tried to convince myself it was just gratitude or loneliness, but I can't deny it anymore." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of joy. "I love you too. I think I have since that first night when you treated me with such kindness when I expected cruelty." As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Clara and Silas walked back to the cabin hand in hand. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future filled with love, partnership, and maybe, just maybe, the children she'd always dreamed of having. The punishment that had seemed so cruel now felt like the greatest blessing of her life. Sometimes, Clara reflected, God worked in mysterious ways indeed. The official marriage contract arrived on a bitter December morning, delivered by the same weathered courier who'd brought Clara to Pine Meadow 4 months earlier. Jake Morrison looked even more uncomfortable than he had during that first journey, his eyes avoiding Clara's as he handed over the folded document with its elaborate territorial seal. "Judge Patterson's compliments, ma'am," Jake mumbled. "Said to tell you this makes everything legal and proper." Clara accepted the papers with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known this day would come, the formal contract that would define her role as Silas's wife, according to the law and the cruel expectations of the town that had exiled her. "Thank you, Jake. Would you like to come in for coffee?" The weathers turned harsh. Jake glanced nervously toward Silas, who stood in the cabin doorway with his arms crossed. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Hastings. I mean, Mrs. McGraw, but I'd best be getting back. Storm's coming in." After Jake departed, Clara and Silas sat at their kitchen table and read the marriage contract together. With each paragraph, Clara felt her anger building. The document was even more degrading than she'd feared, written in cold legal language that reduced her to little more than property. "The woman shall provide cooking, cleaning, and such domestic services as required by her husband," Clara read. Aloud, her voice tight with controlled fury. "She shall be obedient in all matters and grateful for the provision of shelter and sustenance. Should she prove unsatisfactory in her duties, disobedient in her conduct, or fail to produce offspring within 24 months, she may be returned to the territorial authorities for reassignment." Silas's jaw clenched as he continued reading. She shall not engage in activities inappropriate for her station, shall not presume to medical practice without proper credentials, and shall defer to her husband's judgment in all matters of importance. They're trying to stop me from healing, Clara whispered, the full implications hitting her. Word must have reached town about what I've been doing here. Over the past months, Clara's reputation as a healer had grown throughout the mountain communities. She'd successfully treated everything from winter fever to difficult births, earning the trust and gratitude of neighbors who'd become like family. The work gave her life meaning and purpose she'd never imagined possible. Let them try, Silas said grimly. This contract is a legal fiction designed to humiliate you. It has no bearing on who you really are or what you're capable of. But Clara knew the reality was more complex. However unjust the contract might be, it carried the force of territorial law. If she violated its terms, she could be forcibly removed from Pine Meadow and subjected to whatever punishment Judge Patterson deemed appropriate. We need to be strategic, Clara said finally. If we openly defy the contract, they'll use it as justification to tear our life apart. But if we can find ways to work within its constraints while building something they can't easily destroy. That afternoon brought an unexpected test of Clara's resolve. Martha Creek arrived with her youngest daughter, 11-year-old Emma, who was doubled over with severe abdominal pain. The child's face was flushed with fever, and she'd been vomiting since dawn. I don't know what else to do, Martha said near tears. She's getting worse by the hour. Dr. Morrison snowed in at the other end of the valley, and there's no one else. Bring her inside, Clara said immediately, her medical instincts overriding all other considerations. She examined Emma carefully, noting the rigid abdominal muscles and the specific location of the pain. Everything pointed to appendicitis, a potentially fatal condition that required immediate intervention. Silas, Clara called quietly, I need your opinion on something. Silas examined Emma and confirmed Clara's diagnosis. The child's appendix was inflamed and could rupture at any moment. Without surgery, she would almost certainly die within hours. We have to operate, Clara said. Here, now. We can't wait for Dr. Morrison or transport her to town. Martha looked between them with desperate hope. You can do that. You can save her. Clara hesitated, acutely aware of the marriage contract lying on the table in the next room. Performing surgery would be a clear violation of its terms. She would be practicing medicine without credentials, making life and death decisions that the law reserved for licensed physicians. Clara, Silas said quietly, it's your choice, but whatever you decide, I'll support you completely. Clara looked at Emma's pale face, listened to the child's labored breathing, and felt her resolve crystallize. Some things mattered more than legal documents or social expectations. Some choices defined who you really were, regardless of what others might say about you. Martha, we're going to operate on Emma here in the cabin. Silas will perform the surgery, and I'll assist. We've done this procedure before, and we have everything we need. What followed were the most intense 3 hours of Clara's life. Working. By lamplight on the kitchen table, she and Silas removed Emma's inflamed appendix with precision, born of experience and desperation. Clara's hands never trembled as she managed the anesthesia, monitored Emma's vital signs, and assisted with the delicate surgical procedure. When Emma's breathing finally steadied and her fever began to break, Clara felt a satisfaction deeper than any she'd ever experienced. They'd saved a child's life, violated every expectation about women's capabilities, and proven that healing knew no boundaries of law or convention. She's going to be fine, Clara told Martha, who'd waited outside during the surgery but rushed. In the moment they called her, she'll need to rest for several days, and the wound will require careful attention, but she's going to recover completely. Martha threw her arms around Clara, sobbing with relief. You saved my baby, you saved my Emma. How can I ever thank you? Just let her heal, Clara said gently. And perhaps don't mention the surgery to anyone in town just yet. Martha's eyes flashed with understanding and fierce protectiveness. I don't know what you're talking about. Emma got better on her own, far as I'm concerned. Must have been something she ate that made her sick. Over the following days, word spread through the mountain community about Emma's miraculous recovery. Everyone understood, without being told, that Clara and Silas had performed a medical miracle, and everyone also understood that certain things were better left unspoken when it came to town authorities. You realize what you've done, Silas said one evening as they checked on Emma's healing incision. You've chosen your patients over your legal safety. You've decided that being a healer matters more than being a compliant wife. Clara nodded, feeling strangely at peace with her decision. I realized something during Emma's surgery. That contract can define my legal status, but it can't define who I am inside. I'm a healer, Silas. Whether the law recognizes it or not, whether society approves or not, that's who I am. Word of Emma's recovery reached beyond the immediate mountain community. Other families began making the difficult winter journey to Pine Meadow, seeking help that they couldn't find elsewhere. Clara treated frostbite and winter fever, set broken bones and delivered babies, always working within the careful fiction that she was merely assisting her husband rather than practicing medicine independently. The marriage contract remained on their kitchen table, a constant reminder of the legal constraints that governed Clara's existence. But beside it now sat something else. A petition that Martha Creek had quietly organized, signed by every family in the mountain communities. We, the undersigned, do hereby testify to the exemplary character, invaluable medical knowledge, and essential contributions of Mrs. Clara McGraw, the petition began. Her healing skills have saved lives, eased suffering, and provided hope to our isolated communities. We consider her not merely a neighbor, but a treasure whose presence among us represents a blessing to all. The petition contained dozens of signatures, each representing a family that Clara had helped, a life she had touched, a reason why the mountain communities would fight to protect her. It was a testament to the woman she had become and the community she had helped to heal. They're building a legal defense for you, Silas observed as they read through the testimonials. If Judge Patterson tries to claim you're violating the marriage contract, he'll have to explain why helping people should be considered disobedience. Clara smiled, her heart warm with gratitude for the people who'd become her chosen family. I think they're doing more than that. I think they're showing me that home isn't a place you're born to. It's a place where people value who you really are. That night, as snow fell softly outside their cabin windows, Clara burned the marriage contract in their fireplace. She watched. The cruel words turned to ash, feeling liberated from constraints that had never truly bound her heart or spirit. Whatever legal challenges lay ahead, whatever social disapproval she might face, Clara knew she'd found her true calling. She was a healer, a valued member of a community that respected her contributions, and a woman who'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by society's narrow definitions. The punishment that had brought her to Pine Meadow was transforming into the greatest blessing of her life, one patient at a time. The Johnson delivery lasted through the night and into the grey dawn of December. But when Clara finally emerged from the little cabin, she carried with her a healthy baby girl and the gratitude of a relieved family. More importantly, she carried the confidence that came from successfully managing her first independent birth, a breech presentation that could have gone terribly wrong without proper knowledge and steady hands. You saved them both, Martha Creek said, as they walked back through the snow toward Pine Meadow. Martha had stayed to assist, and her respect for Clara's skills was evident in every word. That baby would have died, and likely her mother too, if you hadn't known how to turn her. Clara felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. Dr. Whitman always said that knowledge unused is knowledge wasted. I'm grateful I could help." Over the following weeks, Clara's reputation as a healer spread throughout the mountain communities. She found herself maintaining a careful balance, treating injuries and illnesses, attending difficult births, teaching women about herbal remedies, while always being mindful not to overstep the boundaries that society placed on women's work. Her pressed flower collection grew as she documented every medicinal plant in the high country. Each specimen was carefully mounted with detailed notes about harvesting, preparation, and usage. What had begun as a hobby was becoming a comprehensive medical reference that could benefit the entire region. "You should publish this," Silas suggested one evening, as he watched Clara add detailed drawings to her botanical journal. Medical schools would pay handsomely for such thorough documentation of Rocky Mountain flora. Clara looked up from her careful illustration of wild bergamot. Women can't publish medical texts, even if they could, who would take seriously the work of someone without formal credentials. Times are changing, Clara. There are women doctors now, women researchers. Your work is as thorough and scientific as anything I studied in medical school. Silas moved to look over her shoulder at the precise botanical drawings. This represents years of knowledge and experience. Don't let anyone tell you it's worthless because you learned it outside a university. That night, as they prepared for bed, Silas surprised Clara with a proposal that took her breath away. "Clara, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "What is it?" "I want us to have a real wedding ceremony. Not because of that damned contract, but because I love you and want to make promises to you that have nothing to do with legal obligations." Silas took her hands in his. "I want to marry you as an equal partner, someone I choose to spend my life with, because you make me better than I could ever be alone." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "But where? How?" "The town preacher circuit. Preacher named Father McKenna comes through the mountains every few months. He's due back in January, and he's agreed to perform a ceremony here at the cabin. Martha Creek and her husband will stand as witnesses, along with the Harpers and the Johnsons. It'll be a real wedding, Clara, with people who truly care about our happiness." The idea of a mountain wedding, surrounded by the neighbors who'd become like family, filled Clara with joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that more than anything." As winter deepened, Clara and Silas worked together preparing for their wedding and their future. They spent evenings by the fire, talking about their hopes and dreams, their fears and past sorrows. Clara learned about Silas's childhood in Illinois, his decision to study medicine, the horrors he'd witnessed during the war. Silas learned about Clara's lonely youth, her frustrated desire for education, the crushing shame she'd endured after her husband's death. "Sometimes I wonder if Elizabeth would approve of you," Silas said one snowy evening as they worked together cataloguing medicinal plants. Clara looked up from pressing a sprig of pine needles. "Do you think about her often?" "Less than I used to. For years, guilt was my constant companion. Guilt that I couldn't save her. Guilt that I'd somehow failed her by surviving when she didn't." Silas paused in his writing. "But loving you has taught me that there's room in the heart for more than one kind of love. Elizabeth was my first love, the love of my youth. You're my second chance, my mature love, the person who's taught me that healing isn't always about preventing death. Sometimes it's about choosing life." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I think she would want you to be happy, just as I hope Thomas would want the same for me." As January approached, Clara found herself torn between anticipation and anxiety. The wedding represented everything she'd dreamed of, a true partnership based on love and mutual respect, but the legal complications remained. The marriage contract still hung over them like a storm cloud, and she couldn't shake the fear that their happiness was temporary. "Silas," she said one evening as they planned the wedding feast, "what if they don't accept our marriage? What if Judge Patterson decides that a ceremony performed by a circuit preacher doesn't fulfill the contract requirements?" Silas set down the menu they'd been discussing and pulled Clara into his arms. "Then we'll fight, We'll get a lawyer if we have to. We'll take it to the territorial courts. Clara, I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. This community isn't letting anyone take you away from us. You've become indispensable here. As if to prove his point, there was a soft knock at the door. Clara opened it to find young Sarah Creek, Martha's youngest daughter, holding a carefully wrapped bundle. "Ma sent this for your wedding dress," Sarah said shyly, offering the package. "She said every bride needs something special to wear." Inside the wrapping was the most beautiful dress Clara had ever seen, simple but elegant, made from soft blue wool that would complement her eyes. The needlework was exquisite, with tiny pearl buttons and delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. "The mountain women made it together," Sarah explained. "Ma organized it, but Mrs. Harper did the embroidery. Mrs. Johnson contributed the buttons, and my sisters helped with the sewing. They wanted you to know how much you mean to all of us." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she held the dress against herself. She'd never owned anything so beautiful, never felt so cherished by a community. "Please tell them I've never received a more precious gift." After Sarah left, Clara stood before the mirror holding the dress, hardly believing the woman. Looking back at her, gone was the broken, ashamed widow who'd been sent to the mountains as punishment. In her place stood a confident healer, a beloved community member, a woman about to marry for love rather than duty. "You look radiant," Silas said softly from behind her. "I can hardly believe you're going to be my wife." Clara turned in his arms, her heart full of love and gratitude. "I can hardly believe this is my life. 6 months ago I thought I was cursed. Now I feel like the luckiest woman in the territory." As they held each other in the lamplight, snow falling softly outside their windows, Clara realized that her exile to the mountains hadn't been punishment at all. It had been deliverance, a chance to discover not just what she was capable of, but who she truly was when freed from society's narrow expectations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, surrounded by love and anticipation of their future together, Clara felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her home. The wedding was everything Clara had dreamed it could be. Father McKenna, a kindly Irish priest with twinkling eyes and a gift for making even the most solemn occasions feel joyful, had performed the ceremony in front of the cabin's great stone fireplace. Nearly 24 neighbors had gathered to witness their vows, filling the main room with warmth and laughter. Clara had never felt more beautiful than she did in the blue dress the mountain women had made for her, with wildflowers from Silas's greenhouse woven into her hair. When she'd promised to love, honor, and cherish Silas as his equal partner, words Father McKenna had agreed to include at their request, she'd meant every syllable with her whole heart. The celebration continued late into the evening with music, provided by Bill Harper's fiddle, and enough food to feed twice as many guests. It wasn't until the last neighbor had departed and Clara and Silas were alone as husband and wife that the real world intruded on their happiness. "Mrs. McGraw," Silas said softly as he helped Clara out of her wedding dress, his hands gentle and reverent. "I love the sound of that." Clara turned in his arms, wearing only her chemise, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. "I love being your wife. Your real wife." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, everything Clara had hoped it could be. Silas was patient with her inexperience, loving with her uncertainties, and when they finally came together as husband and wife in truth as well as name, Clara felt as if she'd found the other half of her soul, but their joy was short-lived. 3 weeks later, on a bitter February morning, the sound of horses and official voices outside their cabin shattered the peaceful morning routine. "Delegation from town," Silas said grimly, peering out the window. "Looks like Judge Patterson himself, along with Dr. Morrison and at least 4 other men." Clara's blood ran cold. She'd known this day would come, but she'd hoped they'd have more time to establish their marriage before facing scrutiny. "What do we do?" "We tell the truth and stand together," Silas said, reaching for her hand. "Remember, you're not the same. Woman they sent away. You're my wife, a respected healer and a valued member of this community. The knock on the door was authoritative and demanding. Silas opened it to reveal Judge Patterson, a stern man in his 60s with cold eyes and a disapproving mouth. Behind him stood Dr. Morrison, whom Clara recognized with a shock of anxiety, along with several other town officials she didn't know. "Mr. McGraw," Judge Patterson said without preamble, stepping into the cabin without invitation. "We've come to check on the progress of your arrangement with Mrs. Hastings." "It's Mrs. McGraw now," Silas said evenly. "We were married 3 weeks ago by Father McKenna." Judge Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Married? That wasn't part of the arrangement. The contract specified that she was to serve as your housekeeper and companion, nothing more." Clara felt her temper flare. "Your Honor, the contract also specified that I was to be treated as a wife in all respects. Silas and I chose to make that relationship official before God and our community." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his pale eyes studying Clara with obvious skepticism. "You look well, Mrs. McGraw. Mountain life seems to agree with you." "It does," Clara replied carefully, sensing a trap in his seemingly innocent observation. "I'm surprised," Dr. Morrison continued. "I expected the isolation and harsh conditions to be more of a trial for someone of your delicate constitution." Judge Patterson nodded. "Indeed, we'd heard reports that you've been involving yourself in medical matters despite your lack of training or credentials. Surely Mr. McGraw hasn't encouraged such inappropriate behavior." Clara felt Silas tense beside her, but before he could speak, she stepped forward. "I've used my knowledge of herbal remedies to help neighbors, yes. The same knowledge I gained studying with Dr. Whitman before his death." "Ah, yes, old Whitman," Dr. Morrison said with a dismissive wave. "A competent physician, but he had some peculiar ideas about women's capabilities. I hope he didn't fill your head with nonsense about your ability to practice medicine." "He filled my head with knowledge that has saved lives," Clara replied firmly. "Knowledge that your town sorely needs, given the lack of qualified medical care in the region." Dr. Morrison's face flushed red. "I am the qualified medical professional for this region, madam. Any treatments you've provided without proper training could have dangerous consequences." "Speaking of medical knowledge," Silas interjected, his voice deceptively calm, "Clara tells me you were the one who diagnosed her infertility after her husband's death. Could you describe the examination you performed to reach that conclusion?" Clara's heart began to race. They hadn't planned this confrontation, but she could see where Silas was heading. Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "The examination was, well, the circumstances were quite clear. 3 years of marriage without issue, a husband from a virile family line. The logical conclusion was obvious. Logical, perhaps, but not necessarily accurate," Silas pressed. "Did you perform a physical examination? Take a detailed medical history? Rule out other possible causes?" "I hardly think that's relevant." "It's extremely relevant," Silas cut him off, "because I have performed such an examination, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Clara is perfectly capable of bearing children. In fact, she's in excellent reproductive health." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Judge Patterson looked shocked while Dr. Morrison's face had gone from red to ash-white. "That's impossible," Dr. Morrison stammered. "The Hastings family. Thomas was a fine, healthy man from good stock. Male infertility affects approximately one marriage in 4, Silas said with clinical precision. "It's far more common than society likes to acknowledge. Without examining Thomas Hastings, of course, I can't make a definitive diagnosis, but the evidence strongly suggests that Clara was never the source of their childlessness." Clara watched Dr. Morrison's face crumble as the implications hit him. She'd been scapegoated, exiled, treated as defective, all to protect the reputation of a prominent family and the ego of a dead man. "You're lying," Dr. Morrison said desperately. "You're trying to protect her reputation. I'm stating medical Facts based on a thorough examination conducted by a physician with 15 years of experience, including specialized training in women's health during the war. Silas's voice was ice cold. Would you like me to detail my findings for these gentlemen? Because I documented everything thoroughly. Judge Patterson had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Dr. Morrison, are you saying you never actually examined Mrs. Hastings before declaring her infertile? The circumstances seemed clear. Answer the question, Doctor. Did you or did you not perform a medical examination before pronouncing judgment on this woman's capabilities? Doctor. Morrison's silence was answer enough. Clara felt a surge of vindication mixed with rage. Years of shame, exile from her community, the loss of her home and reputation, all because a doctor was too lazy or prejudiced to do his job properly. Furthermore, Silas continued relentlessly, I have documented proof of Clara's extensive medical knowledge and her success in treating various conditions throughout this mountain community. She has assisted in difficult births, treated injuries and infections, and provided care that has undoubtedly saved lives. To suggest that she lacks medical competence is not only false, but insulting to the people she's helped. Judge Patterson turned to Clara, his expression troubled. Mrs. McGraw, if what your husband says is true, if you were indeed misdiagnosed and sent away under false pretenses, this represents a serious miscarriage of justice. Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. It represents more than that, Your Honor. It represents a system that automatically blames women for circumstances beyond their control, that destroys lives rather than admitting error, and that wastes valuable human resources out of prejudice and ignorance. The room fell silent again. Clara could see the wheels turning in Judge Patterson's mind, the legal and social implications becoming clear. If word got out that the town had exiled an innocent woman based on medical incompetence, and that she'd subsequently flourished in her new life, it would be a scandal that could ruin reputations and careers. What do you want? Judge Patterson asked quietly. Clara looked at Silas, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. I want the truth acknowledged publicly. I want my name cleared, and I want assurance that no other woman will suffer the same. Injustice based on Dr. Morrison's lazy diagnoses. Dr. Morrison started to protest, but Judge Patterson silenced him with a look. And if we were to make such acknowledgments, then we'll continue our lives here in the mountains serving this community as healer and physician, and we'll consider the matter closed. Clara could see Judge Patterson weighing his options. A public scandal that would embarrass the town's medical establishment, or a quiet resolution that would allow everyone to save face while correcting an injustice. Very well, he said finally. Dr. Morrison will prepare a statement acknowledging his error. The original contract will be considered fulfilled and void. Your marriage will be recognized as legitimate, and you'll be free to continue your life here without interference. As the delegation prepared to leave, Dr. Morrison approached Clara one final time. I want you to know that I never intended— Your intentions don't matter, Clara said quietly. Your actions do, and your actions nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life. After the men departed, Clara and Silas stood in their cabin, holding each other tightly. The truth was finally out. Justice had been served, and their future was secure. How do you feel? Silas asked. Clara considered the question. Seriously. Vindicated, relieved, but mostly grateful. If Dr. Morrison had done his job properly, I might never have been sent here. I might never have found you, never discovered what I was truly capable of, never learned that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes, Clara reflected, God's greatest blessings came disguised as punishments, and sometimes the cruelest exile could become the sweetest homecoming. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow from Pine Meadow with unusual haste and filling the creek with rushing water that sang day and night. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the first green shoots push through the dark earth, and marveled at how perfectly the season mirrored her own life. Everything was beginning, again fresh and full of promise. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Judge Patterson and Dr. Morrison, and true to his word, the judge had seen to it that Clara's name was publicly cleared. The official statement, published in the territorial newspaper, had been brief but sufficient. Mrs. Clara McGraw, formerly Hastings, was erroneously diagnosed as infertile following inadequate medical examination. The diagnosis has been determined to be incorrect, and Mrs. McGraw's reputation is hereby fully restored. The statement had caused quite a stir in town, according to the letters that had begun arriving at Pine Meadow. Some were from former friends, expressing shame and regret for their treatment of her. Others were from women seeking medical advice, having heard of her success as a healer. A few were even from physicians in distant cities, requesting copies of her botanical documentation for their own practices. But the letter that mattered most had arrived just yesterday, and Clara held it now as she sat at the kitchen table, reading it for the 3rd time while Silas prepared their morning coffee. "Still thinking about Denver?" Silas asked, setting a cup before her. Clara looked up from the letter, an invitation from the Colorado Women's Medical Association to present her research on Rocky Mountain medicinal plants at their annual conference. "It's a tremendous honor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell says they've heard about my work from colleagues back east, and they believe my documentation could be invaluable for rural medical practices." "But," Silas prompted, hearing the uncertainty in her voice, "but it means traveling to Denver, standing before a room full of educated physicians, presenting myself as an expert when I have no formal credentials." Clara set the letter down and reached for Silas's hand. "What if I embarrass myself? What if they realize I'm just a frontier woman who learned medicine from an old country doctor?" Silas squeezed her fingers gently. "Clara, you've successfully treated dozens of patients over the past year. You've documented over 300 medicinal plants with scientific precision. You've saved lives that would have been lost without your intervention. How is that less valuable than formal education?" Before Clara could answer, there was a familiar knock at the door. Martha Creek entered without waiting for an invitation, her usual practice when she had news to share. "Clara, thank goodness you're here," Martha said, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. "The whole mountain's talking about your invitation to Denver. We're all so proud we could bust." "Martha, I haven't decided whether to go." "Oh, you're going," Martha interrupted firmly. "A question is, are you going alone or are you taking the petition?" "What petition?" Clara and Silas asked in unison. Martha grinned and pulled a thick roll of papers from her coat. "Petition signed by every family in these mountains, testifying to your character, your skills, and your value to this community. Bill Harper organized it after he heard about the Denver invitation. Figured those city doctors ought to know what we think of our Clara." Clara unrolled the petition with trembling hands. Page after page of signatures, each accompanied by a brief statement about her medical care. "She delivered my twins when they came early and saved both their lives. She cured my son's lung fever when the town doctor said he'd die. She taught me about herbs that stopped my monthly pain after years of suffering. There's more," Martha continued, her eyes bright with tears. "We've been collecting stories, Clara. Every person you've helped, every life you've touched. Bill's wife wrote it all down proper, and we're sending it with you to Denver. Those doctors need to know that healing isn't just about what you learned in some fancy school. It's about caring for people and having the courage to use the gifts God gave you." Clara felt her own tears threatening as she read through the testimonials. These people, her friends, her chosen family, had taken the time to document her work, to validate her contributions, to give her the confidence she needed to face the wider world. "I don't know what to say," Clara whispered. "Say you'll go," Martha replied. "Say you'll stand up there in front of all those educated folks and show them what a mountain woman can do. Say you'll make us proud." That evening, as Clara and Silas, walked through their blooming garden, Clara found herself thinking about the journey ahead. Denver was only 3 days by train, but it felt like another world, a place where women physicians practiced openly, where knowledge was valued over convention, where she might finally find her true place in the medical profession. "I'm scared," she admitted as they paused beside the beehives Silas tended with such care. "Of course you are. You're about to do something that could change your life, maybe change how medicine is practiced throughout the territory." Silas pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "But you're also the bravest woman I know. You've already faced down judges and doctors and social conventions. What's one more room full of people who need to hear what you have to say?" That night, Clara lay awake, planning her presentation. She would speak not just about the medicinal properties of mountain plants, but about the broader principles of healing, the importance of listening to patients, of considering all possible causes for illness, of treating women as competent partners in their own medical care. She would tell the story of her own misdiagnosis and exile, not for sympathy, but as an example of what happened when doctors let prejudice override careful examination. 2 weeks later, Clara stood on the platform at the train station in the valley. Town, her research carefully packed in leather portfolios, the community petition tucked safely in her traveling bag. Silas stood beside her, handsome in his best suit, his own medical bag at his side. "You decided to come after all," Clara said, still hardly believing it. "Did you really think I'd let you face this alone? Besides, it's time I stopped hiding on the mountain." Dr. Sarah Mitchell made it clear that they need experienced physicians at the conference, and I have knowledge to share too. Silas smiled at her surprised expression. "We're partners in everything, Clara. That includes this, the train journey." To Denver was Clara's first time traveling by rail, and she marveled at the landscape rushing past the windows. Vast plains giving way to distant mountains, small towns connected by ribbons of steel and steam. It seemed fitting that her first venture into the wider world should be on such a marvel of modern technology. "Nervous?" Silas asked, as the Denver skyline came into view. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but also excited. For the first time in my life, I'm going somewhere not because I have to, but because I want to. Because I have something valuable to offer." The Colorado Women's Medical Association conference was being held at the elegant Windsor Hotel, and Clara felt both overwhelmed and inspired by the gathering of female physicians, nurses, and medical researchers. These women had fought for their education, challenged societal expectations, and carved out space for themselves in a profession that still largely excluded them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, greeted them warmly. "Mrs. McGraw, I can't tell you how eager we are to hear your presentation. Your documentation of Rocky Mountain flora has already generated significant interest among our members." That evening, at the welcome reception, Clara found herself in conversation with women whose experiences both mirrored and differed from her own. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell's protégé, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, spoke about the challenges of practicing medicine as a woman in New York. A nurse named Clara Barton shared stories of battlefield medical care that made Silas nod with grim recognition. "The irony," observed Dr. Mitchell as they discussed the obstacles women faced in medicine, "is that society expects us to be natural caregivers in the home, but questions our competence the moment we try to formalize that caregiving, as if medical knowledge becomes suspect when a woman possesses it." Clara thought of her own journey, from shamed exile to respected healer, and realized that her story was part of a larger narrative playing out across the country. Women everywhere were discovering their capabilities, challenging assumptions, and creating new possibilities for themselves and for future generations. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "I want to tell them about more than just medicinal plants. I want to tell them about what happens when we believe women are capable of healing not just bodies, but entire communities." Dr. Mitchell smiled. "That's exactly what they need to hear." As Clara prepared for bed in her hotel room, looking out at the gaslit streets of Denver, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she'd been a broken woman, convinced of her own worthlessness, exiled to the mountains as punishment for her supposed failures. Tomorrow, she would stand before some of the most accomplished women in the medical profession and share knowledge that could help healers across the frontier. She would represent not just herself, but all the mountain families who had trusted her with their health, all the women who had been told they were incapable of meaningful work, all the healers who learned their craft through experience rather than formal education. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely right. Clara McGraw was ready to change the world. The Windsor Hotel's grand ballroom buzzed with anticipation as Clara made her way to the ornate wooden platform that had been erected for speakers. Every seat was filled, with additional attendees standing along the walls and crowding near the doors. Word of the Frontier Woman's presentation had spread beyond the medical conference, drawing physicians, nurses, medical students, journalists, and curious citizens from across Denver. Clara paused at the foot of the platform steps, her heart pounding as she looked up at the podium where she would deliver the most important speech of her life. This was the same type of platform where she'd once been publicly humiliated in her hometown square, condemned as a failure and sentenced to exile. Now she would use such a platform to reclaim not just her own dignity, but the dignity of every woman who'd been dismissed, discredited, or destroyed by medical ignorance and social prejudice. "Ready?" Silas whispered beside her, his hand briefly touching her elbow in support. Clara nodded, clutching her leather portfolio containing years of meticulous documentation. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped to the podium first, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to introduce Mrs. Clara McGraw, whose revolutionary approach to frontier medicine has challenged our understanding of what it means to be a healer. Her work documenting Rocky Mountain medicinal flora and establishing community-based medical care has already influenced territorial health policy. Today, she will share not only her botanical research, but her philosophy of medicine that puts patient welfare above professional pride." Clara climbed the steps to the platform, her legs steady despite her racing heart. She looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some curious, many openly encouraging. In the front row, she spotted several prominent physicians whose work she'd studied, women who'd fought their own battles for recognition in a male-dominated profession. 2 years ago, Clara began, her voice clear and strong, I stood on a platform very much like this one. But that day, I was being publicly condemned as a worthless woman, sentenced to exile because a physician had diagnosed me as infertile without bothering to perform an examination. A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the dry botanical lecture they'd expected. I accepted that judgment because I'd been taught that women should defer to medical authority, even when that authority was exercised carelessly. I believed I was broken because someone with credentials told me I was broken. I let shame and social prejudice define my worth as a human being. Clara paused, letting her words sink in. But the mountains taught me something that no medical school textbook contains, that healing isn't about authority or credentials or social position. It's about knowledge applied with compassion, observation combined with humility, and the courage to challenge assumptions when lives hang in the balance. She opened her portfolio and displayed her first botanical illustration, a detailed drawing of Rocky Mountain iris with precise notations about its use in treating respiratory ailments. This is Iris missouriensis, mountain iris. Most medical texts dismiss it as ornamental, but mountain folk have used its roots to treat severe lung congestion for generations. When I documented its effects systematically, I discovered it contains compounds that dilate bronchial passages more effectively than many prescribed medications. For the next 30 minutes, Clara shared her research with scientific precision and passionate advocacy. She displayed pressed specimens, detailed illustrations, and careful records of successful treatments. Each plant she discussed represented not just botanical knowledge, but a challenge to medical orthodoxy that dismissed traditional healing wisdom. Gentian root for digestive disorders, wild bergamot for infection, osha for altitude sickness, plants that have saved lives while formal medicine focused on procedures that were often harmful or ineffective, Clara explained, her confidence growing with each example. The question isn't whether these treatments work. The question is why medical education ignores proven remedies simply because they come from sources outside academic institutions. But Clara's most powerful moment came when she addressed the core issue that had brought her to this platform. I want to tell you about Emma Creek, an 11-year-old girl who nearly died from appendicitis last winter. When I examined her, every symptom pointed to a surgical emergency that would be fatal within hours. But according to the legal contract governing my life, I had no right to make medical decisions. I was forbidden from practicing medicine because I lacked formal credentials. The ballroom was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on her words. I had a choice, Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. I could obey the law and let a child die, or I could violate the contract and save her life. We performed emergency surgery on my kitchen table by lamplight, using skills I'd learned through years of study and practice. Emma survived and thrived. Clara looked directly at the skeptical faces in the front row. That surgery was technically illegal because I'm a woman without formal medical training. But Emma Creek is alive today because healing doesn't recognize the arbitrary boundaries that society places around knowledge. Medicine belongs to anyone with the skill and courage to use it in service of human welfare. The tension in the room was palpable as Clara moved toward her conclusion. I stand before you today, not seeking approval for work already done, but challenging this profession to expand its definition of what constitutes legitimate healing. The frontier is full of capable healers, midwives, herbalists, frontier doctors, indigenous medicine people whose knowledge could revolutionize how we treat illness and injury. Clara closed her portfolio and looked out at the audience with complete calm. The medical establishment can continue to guard its privileges and ignore valuable knowledge because it comes from the wrong sources. Or it can embrace the reality that healing wisdom exists wherever there are people dedicated to reducing human suffering. She paused, her final words carrying the weight of personal experience and professional conviction. I was sent to the mountains as punishment for my supposed failures. Instead, I discovered that true medicine has room for everyone who approaches it with competence, compassion, and humility. The question for this profession is whether you're willing to learn from healers who've earned their knowledge outside your institutions, or whether you'll continue to waste human resources because they don't conform to your expectations. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Clara could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the tension of a profession being challenged to examine its own assumptions and prejudices. Then, slowly, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby rose from her seat in the front row and began to applaud. Her action seemed to break a spell. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted in sustained applause, with people jumping to their feet throughout the room. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as the ovation continued, but they weren't tears of relief or gratitude. They were tears of vindication for every woman who'd been dismissed, every healer who'd been ignored, every life that had been lost because knowledge was rejected for the wrong reasons. Dr. Mitchell stepped to the podium, her own eyes bright with emotion. I believe I speak for everyone here when I say that Mrs. McGraw has given us far more than a botanical lecture today. She's challenged us to examine whether our profession serves knowledge or protects privilege, whether we're healers or gatekeepers. As Clara left the podium, surrounded by physicians eager to examine her documentation more closely, she felt as if she were moving through a dream. The response to her presentation had exceeded every hope she dared harbor. Dr. Mary Putnam, Jacoby herself, had requested copies of Clara's botanical illustrations for the New York Women's Medical College. A publisher from Boston was already discussing the possibility of printing her complete herbal guide. Most importantly, 3 territorial governments had expressed interest in establishing frontier medical programs based on her model of combining traditional healing wisdom with scientific documentation. Mrs. McGraw called Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, one of the first licensed female physicians in England who was visiting Denver for the conference. "I wonder if you might consider spending some time in London? The Royal College of Physicians is very interested in your approach to botanical medicine." Clara felt Silas's steadying hand on her back as she navigated the crowd of admirers and questioners. After years of being told she was worthless, the overwhelming validation was almost too much to process. "Clara," Dr. Mitchell approached during a brief lull in the attention, "I have a proposal for you. The Colorado Territory is establishing a new medical training program specifically for frontier conditions. We need someone to head the botanical medicine division, someone who understands both the science and the practical applications. The position would allow you to train other healers, document additional medicinal plants, and legitimize the kind of work you've been doing in the mountains." The offer took Clara's breath away. A few years ago, she couldn't have imagined being offered a position of such responsibility and respect. Now, it felt like the natural culmination of everything she'd learned and accomplished. "It's a generous offer," Clara replied carefully, "but I need time to consider what this would mean for my life in the mountains, for the people who depend on my care there." "Of course. But Clara," Dr. Mitchell's expression grew serious, "what you've accomplished is remarkable, but it's also just the beginning. You have knowledge and insights that could help train hundreds of other healers. You could impact medical care throughout the entire frontier region." That evening, at the conference's closing banquet, Clara found herself seated at the head table between Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Jacoby. The woman who'd arrived in Denver as a nervous mountain healer was now being treated as a respected colleague by some of the most accomplished physicians in the country. "To Clara McGraw," Dr. Mitchell said, rising with her wineglass, "who reminds us that the best medicine comes not from the prestige of our titles, but from the depth of our compassion and the breadth of our knowledge." The entire room rose to toast her, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the shame of her supposed infertility, the fear as she'd traveled to the mountains, the gradual discovery of her own capabilities, and now this overwhelming recognition of her worth. "I have an announcement," Clara said, standing to address the room. The conversations quieted as everyone turned to listen. "Dr. Mitchell has offered me a position developing botanical medicine curriculum for the new Colorado Territorial Medical Program. It's an honor I never could have imagined receiving." She paused, looking out at the expectant faces. "But I've realized something during these past few days in Denver. My work in the mountains isn't separate from academic medicine. It's part of the same continuum of healing. What I've learned from mountain families, from traditional remedies, from trial and error in frontier conditions, that knowledge belongs in medical schools. And the scientific rigor I've developed, the documentation methods, the systematic approach that belongs in every frontier cabin and remote homestead." Clara's voice grew stronger as she continued. "So I'm proposing something different. I'll accept the position, but I want to split my time between Denver and the mountains. I want to bring medical students to Pine Meadow to learn frontier medicine firsthand. I want to train mountain healers in scientific documentation methods. I want to create a bridge between academic medicine and practical healing that serves both worlds." Dr. Mitchell beamed. "That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need." "Agreed. with enthusiasm. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but what mattered most to Clara was the look of pride and love on Silas's face. He'd supported her transformation from broken exile to confident healer, and now he was witnessing her emergence as a leader in medical education. Later, as they walked through Denver's gaslit streets back to their hotel, Clara reflected on how completely her life had changed. 2 years ago, I thought my exile to the mountains was the end of my story. Now it feels like it was the beginning. It was the beginning, Silas agreed, pulling her close. The beginning of you discovering who you really are. And who am I? Clara asked, though she was beginning to know the answer. You're Dr. Clara McGraw, Silas said with a smile. Even without formal credentials, that's who you are. You're a physician, a teacher, a healer, who's going to change how medicine is practiced. Throughout the frontier, you're the woman I love, and you're just getting started. As they reached their hotel, Clara looked back toward the Windsor Hotel where the conference had taken place. Tomorrow they would return to Pine Meadow, but they wouldn't be returning as the same people who'd left. They were returning as partners in a mission that would extend far beyond their mountain sanctuary. The punishment that had seemed so cruel 2 years ago had indeed become the greatest blessing of Clara's life. Sometimes, she thought, God's plans were more beautiful and complex than any human mind could imagine. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of Pine Meadow's newest building, a small but well-equipped medical clinic that served the entire mountain region. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating examination tables, medical supplies, and shelves lined with carefully labeled botanical preparations. In the corner sat a cradle that Silas had carved from mountain pine, its occupant, sleeping peacefully after his morning feeding. Dr. McGraw, called a young voice from the main room. Clara smiled at the title that still felt wonderfully strange after all these months. Coming, Sarah? Sarah Creek, now 18 and Clara's first official apprentice, was preparing for the arrival of their morning patients. 3 other young women from mountain families had joined the training program, learning to combine traditional healing wisdom with modern medical knowledge. The sight of them working together filled Clara with deep satisfaction. Mrs. Johnson's baby is due any day now, Sarah reported, consulting the appointment book. And Tommy Harper is coming in to have that leg wound checked. Oh, and there's a letter from Denver. Looks official. Clara opened the letter with curious fingers, then broke into a delighted smile. The territorial legislature just approved funding for 5 more frontier medical training centers, all based on our model. They want to establish programs in Wyoming, Montana, and New Mexico territories. The success of Clara's innovative approach to frontier medicine had exceeded everyone's expectations. Medical students from Denver came to Pine Meadow for month-long rotations, learning to treat everything from mining injuries to difficult births under conditions far different from city hospitals. Meanwhile, Clara's apprentices were preparing to establish their own practices throughout the mountain communities, carrying forward both traditional healing knowledge and modern medical techniques. Mama? A small voice called from the back room. Clara's heart swelled as it did every time she heard that word. She hurried to the cradle, where 6-month-old Matthew McGraw was beginning to stir. Named for the son Silas had lost so many years ago, baby Matthew had been born healthy and strong the previous autumn, proving once and for all that Clara's supposed infertility had been nothing more than medical ignorance and social prejudice. "Good morning, little man," Clara murmured, lifting her son into her arms. Matthew gurgled contentedly, his dark eyes so like his father's, his tiny fist grasping at Clara's hair. The sight of him never failed to remind Clara of the miracle of her transformation from barren exile to beloved wife and mother. Silas appeared in the doorway, medical bag in hand, ready for his own round of house calls. The past year had seen him fully embrace his return to medical practice, working alongside Clara to provide comprehensive health care to the scattered mountain communities. The guilt and trauma that had driven him to isolation had been largely healed through their shared work and love. "How are my two favorite patients this morning?" he asked, kissing Clara's forehead and touching Matthew's cheek gently. "Thriving," Clara replied, "just like everything else around here." It was true. Pine Meadow had become the unofficial medical center for the entire region. With a steady stream of patients, students, and visiting physicians, the cabin had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and frequent guests. Clara's botanical garden now covered nearly 2 acres, providing medicinal plants not just for local use, but for shipment to medical schools and frontier clinics throughout the West. Martha Creek arrived for her weekly visit, just as Clara finished. Nursing Matthew. Now in her 50s, Martha had become something of a celebrity herself as the subject of one of Clara's most successful case studies, the treatment of severe arthritis using a combination of mountain herbs and therapeutic exercises. "How's our little miracle today?" Martha asked, taking Matthew into her experienced arms. She'd assisted at his birth, one of the most joyful nights in Pine Meadow's history. "Growing bigger every day," Clara replied. "Just like his appetite." As Martha cooed over the baby, Clara reflected on how perfectly her life had come together. The work she'd always dreamed of, the love she'd thought was beyond her reach, the family she'd been told she could never have, all of it was hers now, earned through years of struggle and growth. "Clara," Silas said, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "This came with the morning mail. It's from Judge Patterson." Clara's hand stilled for just a moment. Though their legal troubles had been resolved long ago, the name still carried echoes of painful memories. She opened the letter carefully, then looked up at Silas with surprise. "He's retiring from the bench. It's an apology, a formal, written apology for the injustice I suffered, and a commendation for my contributions to territorial medicine." Clara's voice was quiet with wonder. "He says he's been following my career, and he wants his last official act to be making amends for his first great error in judgment." The letter went on to detail Judge Patterson's plans to donate money for a scholarship fund that would help other women pursue medical training. It was, Clara realized, his way of ensuring that what had happened to her would never happen to another woman in his jurisdiction. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Clara looked around the table with deep contentment. Silas sat beside her, still handsome in middle age, his eyes bright with the love and purpose that had replaced the haunted look of their early days together. Matthew slept in his cradle nearby, occasionally making the small sounds that never failed to make his parents smile. Sarah Creek and the other apprentices had joined them, as was their custom, filling the cabin with young laughter and eager conversation about the day's medical cases. "I have something to share," Clara announced as they finished eating. "Dr. Mitchell has invited me to speak at the National Women's Medical Congress in Chicago next year. They want me to present our frontier training model as an example of innovative medical education." The table erupted in congratulations and excitement. Clara's reputation had spread far beyond the Colorado territory, and invitations to speak and consult came regularly from medical institutions across the country. "Will you accept?" Silas asked, though his proud smile already indicated he knew the answer. "Of course. But I'll bring Matthew with me, and I want Sarah to present alongside me. This work belongs to all of us, every person who believed that healing knows no boundaries." As they cleaned up after dinner, Clara stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The mountain evening was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Pine Meadow spread below their cabin, peaceful and beautiful, the creek murmuring its endless song. 2.5 years ago, she'd arrived here as a broken woman, convinced of her own worthlessness, exiled from everything she'd known. Tonight, she stood as Dr. Clara McGraw, respected physician, devoted wife, proud mother and teacher to a new generation of frontier healers. The cruelest punishment had indeed become life's greatest blessing, and as Clara looked up at the endless stars, Above the mountains she now called home, she knew that her story was far from over. There were still patients to heal, students to teach, barriers to break down, and lives to save. Sometimes, she thought as Silas joined her on the porch with Matthew in his arms, God's plans were more beautiful than any human heart could imagine. And sometimes, the very thing that seemed like the end of hope was actually the beginning of everything you never dared to dream. Clara McGraw was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, surrounded by exactly the love she deserved, and that, she knew, was the greatest healing of all.